My friends, our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia is in big trouble. It got its cheeks clapped right here in Donetsk Oblast. In the past few weeks, the Russian army managed to break through in between two very strategic cities for Ukraine, Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. How did the Russians do it? This is what we will explore in this video with a step-by-step analysis. Yet, our friends from the Kyiv Post wrote, "Momentum is slipping. Russia's summer offensive is losing steam." What? Let's fact check this real quick by looking at the map. This was the frontline situation in mid-April between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka where we last left off. And this is the situation now, 3 months later. The Russians were aura farming like crazy with this offensive. Plus 12 kilometers in this direction, plus 12 kilometers northwards, and plus 20 kilometers to the west. And let's cut the BS. If the Russians capture Radinsky, Pokrovsk will be in an operational encirclement.
It'll be painful.
What a disaster. To be honest, the situation is tragic for Ukraine. Many of their garrisons are now in the process of being encircled. Now, if we consider this as a Russian failure, then I don't even want to see what a Russian success would look like. Somehow, every Russian defeat ends up one step closer to Kyiv.
We are winning!
Oh yeah, before we start, I almost forgot. On the 9th of July, the National Security Journal reported Russia's military is facing catastrophic shortage of armored vehicles. Bruv, stop the cope. The only thing the Russian army is running out of is, flags.
Leave me alone!
In reality, I haven't seen as many Russian armored vehicles in action as in the past few weeks. And let's just say the Donbass coal miners had a little bit too much time on their hands. The Russian military now has the 2.0 version of the Tsar tank. Literally like a porcupine. It's completely covered by thousands of metal bars. 60 drones were needed to knock it out. 60! The big question remains, how is Ukraine going to defend two strategic cities at the same time? This video is sponsored by MyHeritage. MyHeritage has been a long-time partner of my channel. Thanks to them, I was able to build my family tree from this to this. Look at all the names and 96 people going back as far as 8 generations. Truly insane. Overall, what strikes me is always how smooth the entire process was. All you have to do is input as many names as you can, and MyHeritage will piece together your family tree for you by looking through 33 billion historical records. I repeat, I went from half a dozen names to 96. Your family tree will literally build itself. This time I worked on my mom's side, and that's how I managed to trace back my ancestry up to the late 1600s. So last time we saw how on my dad's side many had fought during World War I. Well, guess what? Same thing on my mom's side. Here's my great-great-grandfather, Mr. Kozler, or Kozler, or Kosla, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The archives revealed how he was baptized on the 22nd of December 1870. That's also how I learned that he was reported as KIA in June 1917 at the age of 46. Pretty old to be at the front if you ask me. However, 10 years before the war, he had my great-grandmother Josephine Kozler. I learned all this thanks to MyHeritage. On MyHeritage, you can also colorize, enhance, and restore some of your old family pictures. That's what I did, and I was very impressed with their state-of-the-art, deep nostalgia technology to animate these pictures. Just wow. If you're interested in studying your family history, I think you'll love it the same way I did. If you want to enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer, click on the link below or scan the QR code on screen to start your 14-day free trial. Alright, to fully comprehend everything that happened, we have no other choice but to go back to mid-April 2025, which is also where we last left off. This was the frontline situation by the 15th of April in the sector of Pokrovsk. The Russian 20th Command Arms Army tried to outflank Pokrovsk from the west, but then met multiple Ukrainian counterattacks which pinned them down. The Russian command thought of new alternatives to deal with Pokrovsk. At the end of my previous video, I also said the following. But there's a second option for the Russian army. That is to jump on a defensive mode around Pokrovsk, while they shift their focus on the eastern side of the city. That could explain why Russian artillery has been ramping up strikes in this direction, near the village of Nova Poltavka. Meanwhile, in support of this theory, on the 12th of April, a Russian column tried to outflank Yelizavetivka from the west. From there, they could push an open field towards the large urban area of Novo-Ekonomichne, from where they could start a grinding battle, house by house, towards Pokrovsk.
Write this down.
Remember that, okay? We'll get back to it later in the video. Now that we're in the headquarters, let's roll for the sequence of events. That's why we have to pay attention to the situation 30 kilometers to the east. On the 16th of April, men of the Russian 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment raised their banner on Kalinove. In this video, you can see a Russian soldier that threw an explosive charge inside a dugout before running away. Seconds later, the entire position detonated. Meanwhile, 10 kilometers to the west, Russian forces were trying to get control of the TO504 road linking Pokrovsk to Kostiantynivka. If the Ukrainian army lost control of this road, this would severely impact lines of communications across the entire Donetsk front. In order to stop enemy progression, a Ukrainian tank of the 1st Tank Brigade carried a fire mission against the factory in Vodiane Druhe. As you can see here, the tank blew heavy loads of ordnance at point blank, 4 times in a row, plus a 5th one on desert on its way home. You see, due to Ukraine's shortage of manpower, they can't physically retake these locations, so these fire missions have become a routine, and the best thing they can do is attempt to inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible. The next day, on the 17th, the Russians attempted to storm Yelizavetivka. Once again, the Ukrainian 14th Chervona Kalina Brigade of the National Guard held its ground. In this footage, you see a line of dragon's teeth. A Russian troop transport was destroyed there, while another keeps driving. In this frame, we see 3 vehicles charging down a road. The first one is spotted by a drone. Moments later, we see it nosediving to the side of the road as the remaining vehicles get chased down. Meanwhile, this entire squad of riflemen attempted to move beyond this farm after having dismounted from their motorcycles, but quickly they had to disperse as drones showed up. Overall, in this firefight, the Ukrainians claim to have destroyed 21 Russian armored vehicles and eliminated 240 soldiers.
Right.
Let's call this artistic liberty because that's not what I saw. I counted 3 destroyed armored vehicles at best. If we add taxes and tip, maybe 4 vehicles, but that's it. Only a few kilometers from there, the Russians tried to secure Vodiane Druhe, the place with the factory. Actually, hold on, I'm not even sure it's a factory. It's time to fact check myself. Okay, so this was the building before the war, and it says it was a meat processing plant called Ukraine Bacon. Next thing you know, in the comment section, you have someone asking, is it halal? Anyway, back to the battle. We see 3 MTLBs covered in nets and cages. Shout out to the Donbass coal miners. The moment they disembark, the infantry, one after the other, the troop transports get destroyed, including multiple units of motorcyclists, the modern dragoons. Nonetheless, many Russian riflemen still managed to dig in their new positions. The Russian attempt to break through was thwarted, at least for now, because a couple days later, on the 23rd of April, Russian assault detachments managed to advance along this 2.5 kilometer long tree line and gained a foothold inside Tarasivka. It seems that this time the Russian command of the 20th Division managed to concentrate its forces without being detected. Only 1 BMP was destroyed near Baranivka as it brought troops to the front. 24 hours later, more Russian gains, thus securing the entire southern part of Tarasivka, as well as in this forest right next to our beloved Ukraine Bacon factory. Meanwhile, further to the east, Deep State UA conceded the loss of Kalinove and its surroundings, 10 days after the Russians secured the entire village. But we don't have time, we have to go back to that factory ASAP, because on the 27th, Uruk-hai detachments were spotted 800 meters behind it. I mean, you don't want men with such big spears playing in your back. Ukrainian drones were unleashed and bombarded any unit they could find. They also double-tapped vehicles that had already been immobilized because of numerous minefields like this pickup truck. We can also see how the Ukrainians built these huge anti-tank ditches. Are they effective? Don't know. Actually, I do know, but you'll see later in the video. But more importantly, look at the trenches in which Russian stormtroopers are evolving. There is zero cover against drones apart from these bunkers. Everything is out in the open. So this goes to show that yes, Ukrainian engineering units did build a lot of fortifications, but they're useless. No wonder all the positions are falling, one after the other. In this next Ukrainian drone footage, we get a bird's eye perspective of an entire defensive position. Here's the anti-tank ditch, and here are the trenches. We can also notice how the bunkers are getting destroyed one by one, meaning nobody can effectively defend this position. And the tragedy is that a lot of Ukrainian veteran units will outright refuse to be deployed there. They know the danger. So the only ones the Ukraine command can send there are mobilized personnel. While Russian forces are overwhelming Ukrainian positions near the TO504 road, further reinforcements are arriving by foot in small groups of 3 to 4 men. To support their next move, Russian drone operators made sure to clear the sky of enemy drones. And just like modern-day Shtukas, they engaged all Ukrainian units within a 4-kilometer radius of the contact line. By doing so, they pinned down the much-needed Ukrainian reinforcements, like this T-62 MV, this Humvee, this Cossack APC, this Max Pro MRAP, numerous pickup trucks, and a mortar. May 2025. Now, eyes open, pay attention, things are gonna go very fast. The Russian commander of the 20th Division concentrated 2 entire infantry companies, about 200 men, which took up positions in all possible houses inside the village. The follow-up Ukrainian counterattacks failed to dislodge the enemy assault. It's not a surprise that by the end of the 29th of April, Tarasivka fell into the gray zone, bringing Russian forces 3 kilometers forward. Shortly after, on May 1st, Deep State UA officially declared the loss of Tarasivka. 24 hours later, on the 2nd of May, the Russians expanded their breakthrough, with some of their forward elements already spotted in Alexandropil. Then on the 4th, it's Zelenipoli that fell, and by the 5th, the Russians were already shoving their tip inside Yablunivka. Within a week, the Russians had broken through 6 kilometers.
Another fuck up. Another fuck up.
The Ukrainian defense in this sector completely exploded. How could such a debacle happen to the AFU? Well, I'll tell you why. The Ukrainian command positioned the 157th Mechanized and 111th Territorial Defense Brigades in that sector of Tarasivka since January. They remained there without rotations for months, while suffering badly from battle attrition. In this article about the 157th Mechanized Brigade, we can learn the following. The brigade's personnel did not receive the essential combat coordination training prior to their deployment. As a result, it is claimed that casualties have reached up to 40% in some elements of the brigade. One of the soldiers of the 157th said the following in an interview with the newspaper Hromadske. I was supposed to train on anti-tank missile systems. We finished basic combat training and we were waiting to be sent for specialized training. Instead, we were deployed to Pokrovsk, with many of us sent to the front lines. Some immediately refused and surrendered their weapons. You know what was the answer of the brigade commander? Can you guess what he said? There was no time for certain training.
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
The brigades of the 150 series were a complete disaster for the AFU. We all remember the French-trained 155th Mechanized Brigade, and the 157th is just another example. If you're interested, I made an entire video about it last year. Link will be in the description below. These two brigades, the 157th Mechanized and 111th Territorial Defense, that were filled with untrained mobilized personnel, naturally faced mounting losses, with no veterans nearby to guide them through this battlefield. This is outright criminal. When the Russian 20th Division struck, everything collapsed like a house of cards. The neighboring 117th Heavy Mechanized and 109th Territorial Defense Brigades already had their hands full and could only watch the disaster unfold. The poor Mobiks in Tarasivka then faced drone strikes, tanks, artillery shelling, obliterating any stronghold or shelter. As they were pinned down, Russian Storm detachments showed up on motorcycles. A Ukrainian soldier with a call sign Muchnoi reported, "Our infantry did not withstand the onslaught and began to run."
Our men flee the battlefield!
Like Zelensky said in chapter 11, make sure to place your weakest units at the most critical point. If we zoom out, we can see the scale of the disaster. Look at the size of the gray zone. The Russians already had detachments in Malinivka, Novopoltavka, Novolenivka, Alexandropil, and even Staromykolaivka. And this breakthrough would literally change the course of the entire battle. In this video, you can see the charge of Russian MTLB troop transports, driving by this farm, dodging cluster munitions in an open field that has more craters than an IFBB Pro's back. Eventually, they reach a village. On the map, we can trace back their itinerary. We can see that they drove along this path, beyond the farm, and then towards the settlement of Yablunivka. That's where the vehicles disembarked their infantry component before heading back. Moments later, 2 of them were hit by FPV drones. Yablunivka is here on the map, but same thing happened on the other side in Alexandropil. You can see a vehicle of the 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment. It disembarked an entire squad before driving off. The soldiers scattered across the village, faster than African street vendors around the Eiffel Tower running away from the police. A couple hours later, the men of the 242nd raised their banners for some souvenirs. I actually have this video to show you. Here we have 2 Ukrainian soldiers, Danilo and Bogdan. Russian soldiers are everywhere, they're just trying to escape. 2 of their comrades have already fallen right next to them. They try to get cover, and that's when they're hit by an FPV drone. The only thing that comes to mind when watching these videos is war is hell. Same story in Novopoltavka, where more armored vehicles landed their riflemen. So when reports claim the Russians don't have armored vehicles anymore, just look at the footage. What we can also notice is how all these armored vehicles have been seriously upgraded with nets and big cages specifically to defend from enemy drones. We remember it was such a silly idea that now the Ukrainians are doing the exact same thing. Then the Ukrainians organized a counterattack to regain the entrance of the village. However, here you see 2 of their armored vehicles destroyed, and all these riflemen running for cover towards these trenches. Looking at the way they're grouped up, they look like mobilized personnel. Dozens of Ukrainian riflemen then mop up these trenches. However, due to enemy resistance, it seems the assault detachment then just ran away from the dugouts. This position was defended by men of the Russian 255th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, named after the 1944 Battle of the Korsun Pocket. On the 7th of May, Deep State UA acknowledged the 4-kilometer breakthrough by the Russian 20th Division, with Yablunivka and Alexandropil completely swarmed. The Russian Divisional Command then directed an increasing number of rifle squads towards Yablunivka, either in small squads of infantrymen moving from dugout to dugout, or with troop transports having to cross 6 kilometers at all speeds to avoid being targeted by enemy firepower. On the 9th of May, the Russians expanded their area of control northwards and especially towards Novopoltavka. Russian drones were roaming across the entire front, like Nazguls. One Supercam S was intercepted right here south of Yablunivka. It's not a surprise that 24 hours later, Russian assault detachments advanced 1,500 meters in that direction. On the 11th, the Russians secured the bacon factory in Vodyany Druhe, and the next day they completed the capture of Yablunivka. Essentially, all the Ukrainian positions south of the TO504 road had been overwhelmed. If we zoom out, its location is strategic because it's right in between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. By the 13th of May, Russian storm detachments advanced 3 kilometers and were now firmly controlling the eastern part of Yablunivka. We can see that most of these gains were made possible due to motorcycle squads, which drove rapidly, dismounted, and started taking up abandoned Ukrainian positions. My friends, I just dropped a brand new video diving into the real sci-fi tech being built for SWAT teams right now. We're talking exoskeletons, smart ballistic shields, drones, robot dogs, and augmented reality. It's insane and it's not fiction, because it's currently in development. If you're interested in futuristic tactics and gear, the link is in the description below, don't miss it. On the 14th of May, the Russians made more gains in Yablunivka and mopped up the area between Novopoltavka and Yablunivka. During this push, a column of armored vehicles was ambushed by multiple FPV drones of the Ukrainian 109th Territorial Defense Brigade. I mean, that's what we see, but we don't know the total of BMPs that were actually used during this attack. For all intents and purposes, that could be the 3rd run of these BMPs back and forth. And notice how we have no footage from the 157th Mechanized and 111th Territorial Brigades. This goes to show how both these units simply vanished from the battlefield. Let's go back to the map. Actually, no, check out this footage. A regular video of Ukrainian drone strikes on isolated Russian riflemen. But no, it's a total nightmare. On the map, these forward patrols were spotted in Zoria, 6 kilometers beyond the contact line. As you can see, it cannot possibly get worse than that for our beloved AFU. By the 16th of May, in the sector of Rodivka, Russian forces pushed 2 kilometers across the Kazeny Tariets River, and now all of Mirolubivka fell inside the gray zone. Again, in small fire teams of 4 men, Russian forces infiltrated the abandoned Ukrainian fortifications. And once inside the village, now in ruins, they raise their banner. If we zoom out, it's actually very close to Pokrovsk, only 10 kilometers away. Meanwhile, on the main battlefield, the 20th Division wanted to expand its area of control northwards. That's why they targeted the entire contact line to clear out the remaining Ukrainian garrisons. Meanwhile, if we look between Yablunivka and Nova Poltavka, the Russians secured this very strategic highway overpass. That's when the Russian Dostoyevsky Battalion, the Bashkir Wolves, of the 57th Regiment attached to the 6th Division, mounted an assault and flanked Nova Poltavka from the west. In this footage, we see an armored vehicle of the BMP type, driving at full speed across open terrain. Notice how it just bridges over the anti-tank ditch before hitting a mine. But incredible, it keeps going. The clip cuts and then we see the first stormtroopers jump inside the trench, followed by second one. That's when they engage Ukrainian soldiers that barricaded themselves in this bunker. The assault team used explosives to detonate the entire structure before moving on to the next. Ukrainian fire teams are still operating in nearby trenches. Moments later, the two-man Russian team faced another Festung. They deal with it by throwing an anti-tank mine. Big explosion, and then continue using the same method, one stronghold after another. It's not very Hollywood-like, it's not very fancy, but it gets the job done. And this is also a perfect example of when an attack is properly coordinated, the defenders can actually lose more troops than the attacking force. That's when the Bashkir Wolves raised the white-blue-red flag on Nova Poltavka. That means that on top of the 20th Division that achieved this breakthrough, we now have the 6th Division that came in support as part of the second wave. Clearly, the Russian command is now transferring a lot of its available reserves right in the sector to exploit the breach. And that also goes to show how the Russian army headquarters is very good at maneuvering entire regiments and divisions on the map. As a result of this attack, on the 17th of May, the Ukrainians abandoned all the remaining positions south of the TO504 road as well as east of Yablunivka. The problem at this point for the Ukrainian command is that once the first defensive positions have been breached, resistance becomes disorganized and fragmented. The attacker can exploit gaps, bypass isolated strongholds, and just push deeper and more rapidly in the rear, where defenses are thinner and coordination weaker. So even if the Ukrainians in theory have a defense in depth, that only actually works when you have manpower defending these fortifications. That's why on the 18th of May, the armed forces of Ukraine faced an absolute disaster. Deep State UA conceded the loss of 4 kilometers of ground along a 5-kilometer front. All the positions between Nova Poltavka and Yablunivka have effectively been wiped out. That's exactly in this direction in which the Bashkir Wolves attacked. That's when these men of the 57th Regiment officially raised their banners on Nova Poltavka. The 57th includes volunteer battalions from the Moscow region, the Republic of Bashkortostan, as well as the Republic of Tatarstan, which you can see displayed here on this flag. As you can see, there's a strong sense of regionalism in Russia. By the 19th of May, the salient centered on Zoria started contracting, with the gray zone expanding 3.5 kilometers all the way to Hnativka. On the western side of the map, a reported 2.5 kilometer thrust towards Yelizavetivka. 24 hours later, plus 2 kilometers between Nova Poltavka and Yablunivka. And it keeps going. On the 21st of May, 2 kilometers gained beyond Yablunivka, with Russian forces reaching the first houses of Yablunivka. And I'm not done. On May 22nd, another 2-kilometer advance beyond Nova Poltavka. Everything was collapsing. Russian forces are already 8 kilometers beyond Tarasivka in all directions. I wanted to show you this video where you can see a drone strike on a Ukrainian dugout. But pay attention to at least 30 artillery shell craters, and those are only the ones that are visible without counting the ones in the tree line. Russian firepower literally plowed through this Ukrainian stronghold. This is part of the preparation before the assault of the ground component. We're very far from these human wave tactics. Au contraire, the Russians are showing excellent inter-arm coordination. 23rd of May, no territorial losses to be reported for the Ukrainians.
It's a success.
And then the nightmare restarted on the 24th. Remember the Russian vanguard that landed in Zoria, while the second wave managed to clear all the Ukrainian positions between Alexandropil all the way to the Kalinivka River. At the same time, Russian artillery batteries unleashed an intense artillery barrage on Zoria. This breakthrough was made possible by the 12th and 19th Motor Rifle Regiment from the Republic of Bashkortostan, the good old Siberians. That's also when some of the remaining civilians went to hug what they perceived as their liberators, and the Ukrainians were pretty salty about it. As a result of this offensive action, a big cauldron was about to be cut off. In response, on the 25th of May, the Ukrainians urgently withdrew from this area, 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. What I didn't tell you was while the Russian 20th Division broke through between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, the 150th Motor Rifle Division attached to the 8th Command Arms Army pushed in parallel to the 20th Division just on the eastern side of the H-20 highway, and together they tag-teamed the Ukrainian forces. So allow me to go a little bit back in time to see how the Russians even got there. Actually, the first ones that got there were the German Mennonites that founded Romanivka in 1889. But since the water supply under the village was of poor quality, the Mennonites moved a couple kilometers and founded the neighboring village of Zoria in 1890. Life was good until the Russian Civil War, where they got targeted by Bolshevik forces and anarchists on the Makhno for being wealthy farmers. As a result, many died, and 20,000 of the surviving Mennonites immigrated to Canada and the US. Now, as for the war in Ukraine, on the 17th of April, soldiers of the 68th Tank Regiment of the 150th Division raised the Russian flag on Valentinivka. 6 days later, that same 68th Tank Regiment, supported by the 20th Motor Rifle Regiment, captured Chuhabalka. During this push forward, many firefights erupted in trench networks. But in this one, it's the Ukrainian defenders that had the upper hand. By the 15th of May, the Ukrainian 20th Lyubart Brigade observed Russian troops south of Romanivka. 10 days later, the Russians were inside the village. And on the 27th of May, the 68th Tank Regiment raised its banners on Romanivka. That's when the Ukraine command urgently redeployed the 2nd Battalion of the elite 5th Assault Brigade, Azov. And we're back to the present where both storylines reunite. On the 27th of May, the AFU faced yet another disaster. The tentacles of this monster kept growing. This pocket along the H-20 highway continued collapsing. Meanwhile, at the northern tip of the salient, the Russians advanced another kilometer towards Yablunivka. To stop them, dozens of drones were released by the Ukrainians, striking exposed Russian infantrymen, or if lucky, armored columns. On a side note, this is how we even know how far the Russians have reached inside Yablunivka, because of these Ukrainian drone footage made public. And if we look to the west, Russian forces advanced another 800 meters inside Malinivka. To celebrate the complete capture of the settlement, the 9th Motor Rifle Brigade raised its battle flags at the western edge of the village. And you know what? Deep State UA only acknowledged the loss of this village on the 17th of June. Maybe some Ukrainian rifle teams still garrisoned the village by then, but highly unlikely. By that point, the Russian salient was now 11 kilometers wide. Of course, this is the Deep State UA account. In reality, forward patrols of the Russian army were already reported in Popivyar. That means the Ruskies were 1.5 kilometers beyond the frontline situation as reported by Deep State UA. In this footage, we have 4 Russian soldiers trying to attack a house in Popivyar. For sure, their mission was to loot and look for washing machines. But their mission was interrupted when they heard incoming drones and they quickly scattered. Similar story west of Yelizavetivka in this tree line north of the village. There we see a fire team of 4 Russian soldiers stealthily moving through the greenery, walking along an anti-tank ditch, before resting in a dugout. Suddenly the tunnel starts speaking Ukrainian. Immediately the Russians fire at will inside the dugout and clear out this entire position. Now once again the next part is pretty tragic. We see 2 Ukrainian soldiers from that same squad casually walking with bags full of supplies. The moment they reach the trees, they get ambushed. They didn't see it coming. One of them immediately falls to the ground, KIA. The other one managed to run away, but according to the last part of that drone footage, his unalived body was found in the middle of the steppe. Again, it's really hard to watch these videos. But the 29th of May, Deep State conceded the loss of Romanivka. At the same time, Russian forces raised the white-blue-red banner on Stara Mikolaivka. The next day, the pocket contracted once more, plus 1,400 meters for the Russians. The Ukrainians there were in the middle of a rearguard battle. You fight your way out from one cauldron just to fall in another, a bit like in the movie Cross of Iron. Later that day, the Russian 10th Tank Regiment of the 150th Division raised its banners on the village of Nativka. So how about we wrap up everything that happened in May? Because this is where we saw the bulk of Russian gains. This was the situation on May 1st, and that was the situation at the end of the month. And if we zoom out further, we see how the Russian armed forces effectively secured this very strategic portion of the T05-04 road linking Pokrovsk to Kostiantynivka. Now, in the coming month of June, do you think the Russian army will push west towards Pokrovsk, east towards Kostiantynivka, or are they gonna go off-road and hit the north? On the 1st of June, Zoria, and thus the entire cauldron, fell into enemy hands, as men of the 3rd Battalion, 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment swarmed the place,
We have captured a building, my lord!
and later raised their banner on the village. They also claimed the capture of 13 Ukrainian soldiers. We can still admit that Ukraine's pull-out game is strong. Even though this entire cauldron was collapsing, the Russians only captured 13 soldiers. Could have been much worse. In this footage, you can also get a bird's eye view of this infamous village of Zoria. Shortly after, the Russian 10th Tank Regiment that also decided to officialize the capture of the settlement. You saw the flags the Russians used. We all know what would happen if German soldiers also suddenly decided to raise historical battle flags.
They put you in jail right away. No trial, no nothing.
Actually, the only place where they could do this safely is Ukraine. Oh yeah, disclaimer, Deep State UA only announced the fall of Zoria on the 4th of June. So, not too bad. June 2025. The next hotspot in this campaign was to be Yablunivka, 7 kilometers to the north. At the center of the village, a Finnish-made Sisu XA-180 armored personnel carrier was damaged. The Ukrainian command dispatched dozens of FPV drones to hunt down motorcyclists that started reinforcing the garrison that initially secured a foothold in Yablunivka. In this footage, you can see 2 Russian soldiers dropping explosives into this building occupied by Ukrainian troops. Further south, BMPs of the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment disembarked riflemen into this tree line. What's interesting is how right after landing the infantry, the BMP released a huge smoke screen. In this situation, the smoke screen is more likely to interfere with the adjustment of enemy artillery fire. It prevents drones from getting the proper coordinates to guide artillery batteries, and the quick escape is to evade FPV drones. At the same time, we will quickly peek to the western side of the map in Novoekonomichne. There the Russians reported having destroyed a Ukrainian T-64 tank. I'm telling you this little fait divers so that you remember the spot for later in the video. Not far from there, in Mirne, Russian aviation bombarded Ukrainian positions. Here you can see the results of this airstrike of 4 FAB-500s.
They dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I'd never seen before.
In this area, a Russian Zala drone was also intercepted. This information was important because it indicated how the Russian command was trying to get all the intel for something in this direction. On the 7th of June, the Ukrainians retreated 1,800 meters and abandoned the western part of Yablunivka. And by the 10th, Russian forces mopped up this 7-kilometer front. As you can see, they kept getting closer and closer to Yablunivka, and always by attacking from multiple directions, as to force the Ukrainians to spread out their defensive capabilities. In response of these enemy incremental gains, the Ukrainian command dispatched immediate reinforcements. That's when 2 of their M113 APCs were knocked out south of the village of Yablunivka. At the same time, you can see how the gray zone also expanded into Papivyar. There, in small rifle teams, the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment battled through the settlement, going from one house to another. 13th of June, another set of bad news to swallow for the Ukrainian command. In the sector of Malinivka, plus 2,700 meters along a 5-kilometer front. In the process, the Russians captured 3 of these big farming complexes. Here's a bird's eye view of one of the places. And as you can see at the top, it's the 1st Sturm detachment of the 39th Motor Rifle Brigade that captured it. In this footage, we can also see an assault squad mopping up this well-built trench bastion, as opposed to all the other fortifications that we've analyzed so far. In this one, everything is covered up, with numerous underground tunnels and positions to protect the soldiers moving around the bastion. Together, this Russian assault team clears one trench line after another, They do so by throwing numerous grenades. One group of soldiers is located inside the dugout, and another is moving from above. At the end of this firefight, they claim that out of the 7 defenders, 3 were KIA and 4 managed to escape. That's only one sample of the entire Russian axis of attack. But imagine dozens of such units operating at the same time. If we go back to the map, 4 elements of the Russian army were already spotted 4 kilometers ahead in Koptieve. Overall, you can see how the Ukrainian front in that sector was like a sieve. It was like the Schengen borders, anyone got through. Now if we move a bit to the eastern side of the map, on the 14th of June, the Ukrainian 36th Marine Brigade struck a Russian 120mm 2B11 mortar near Yablunivka. What's interesting is to analyze how fast the Russians can bring their fire support up close. And from this position, the mortar with a 7-kilometer effective range can strike Popov Yar, Rusin Yar, and Yablunivka. Further to the east, this salient was in a critical posture and it was filled with some of Ukraine's most elite forces, composed of the 5th Assault Brigade Azov, the 12th Brigade Azov, and the Lyud Police Brigade. 100% their mission is to slow down the Russians and cover the safe withdrawal of all friendly forces. On the 17th of June, the Russians advanced another 3 kilometers along this tree line. This forced all Ukrainian units to abandon their positions. Only 3 kilometers remained until Yablunivka. At the same time, the Russian 20th Division tried to expand its area of control northwards with a good old mechanized assault. In this footage, we can see one armored vehicle. Blyat! Steel graveyard of 4 vehicles! Nope, I'm out of here! What's crazy is that we have a video from the same event, but from another angle. We see how 3 Russian BMPs and 1 tank were stopped by an anti-tank ditch. And this is where they got knocked out, figuring out what to do next. Then we see the crews of these vehicles running around like NPCs, because they're blocked by the ditch and barbed wire. So this is a good example of anti-tank ditches actually being useful, despite their relative simplicity. The next day, on the 18th of June, the Ukrainians withdrew another 800 meters along this tree line. Simultaneously, from Zoria, the Russians also carried a surprise attack against Alexander Kalinove, with the aim of encircling Yablunivka, but like the other column, they got clapped by none other than the 12th Brigade Azov. If we zoom in, we have these 2 Russian battering rams, straight out of Age of Empires, that eventually get knocked out. This is where we have to zoom out, because on the 19th of June, Russian forces advanced 2 kilometers all around the salient. They eliminated Ukrainian positions between Malinivka and Yelizavetivka, gained a foothold in Koptieve, and secured that part of the TO504 road where the mechanized assault flopped. In total, the Russian armed forces controlled a 20-kilometer portion of the TO504 road. 24 hours later, on the 20th, the Russians advanced 700 meters along the Bichok River north of Yablunivka. At the same time, the Ukrainians lost control of the western side of the settlement, as dozens of rifle squads of the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment stormed the urban area. The situation became critical for the few remaining Ukrainian defenders stranded behind enemy lines. Once again, it's only on the 7th of July that Deep State UA acknowledged the loss of this entire western part of Yablunivka. That's when the Russian command called for a renewed mechanized assault for the final blow. But the AFU spotted the enemy concentration of forces and struck multiple Russian armored vehicles before they could even reach the contact line. On the 23rd, since resistance in Koptieve was a bit too stiff, the Russians operated a flanking maneuver from the north, once again with small infantry units infiltrating wooden areas to evade drone detection. What's interesting is that we even have a video of these same men, but a couple weeks before, as they were undergoing training. You can see the type of drills the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment organized. That would also make a pretty sick paintball map. The front remained calm for the next few days. The Russians lost momentum. The Russians kept their surprise for the end of the month. On the 30th of June, Koptieve collapsed. Russia advanced 5 kilometers all the way to Razine and the Kazini-Tarets River. Further south, Russian forces got closer to Novoekonomichne and are now only 1,700 meters away from this very important town, the gate to Pokrovsk. If it falls, the Russians will be able to flank the entire Ukrainian battle line. So in summary, between June 1st and June 30th, Russian forces worked on expanding the girth of their salient, as it's now 19 kilometers from one end to another. July 2025. On the 5th of July, the Russians advanced closer to Popov Yar. At the same time, Russian infantry units pushed north of Koptieve and started entering Novotaretsk. Not far from there, other storm detachments started occupying buildings in Razine before being shelled by Ukrainian artillery. In this video, you can see Ukrainian scouts of the 123 Reconnaissance Regiment leaving the village of Novotaretsk, indicating that the AFU had indeed abandoned the settlement. As Russian troops spread across Razine, the headquarters directed a mechanized assault against the northern part of Novoekonomichne, which didn't succeed. Since the Russians were denied rear entry, they just attacked on the main road. Here we see a Russian tank equipped with a mine trawl, followed by two BMPs that got the Germany World War I tank skin. This convoy plows through until they're stopped bumper to bumper like on Dekari, and then we see the soldiers disembark. But then another column with the same composition reached the town. The tank returned from its escort mission and the BMPs disembarked, its riflemen everywhere. And the Russians slid right in. That's how the gray zone expanded to the entire southern part of Novoekonomichne, and as a result, these Ukrainian pockets were essentially gone. Remember what I said, isn't it what we're witnessing right now? Meanwhile, in support of this theory, on the 12th of April, a Russian column tried to outflank Yelizavetivka from the west. From there, they could push an open field towards the large urban area of Novoekonomichne, from where they could start a grinding battle, house by house, towards Pokrovsk. Let's zoom out a little and we have to go north to Yablunivka. On the 8th of July, the Russians expanded their area of control on both flanks. On the left, 7 tree lines were cleared, and on the right, the Russians advanced 700 meters. By the 10th of July, the Russians expanded their area of control and started pushing towards Poltavka. On the 13th, they launched a large assault on Yablunivka. There, a storm detachment of the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment was seen advancing along the main road of the village. Simultaneously, an armored column attacked to the east along the same road where we saw the battering rams. But this time, they managed to push 3.5 kilometers and secured the outskirts of Alexandro-Kalinove. In this video, you can see a column of these porcupine tanks. One of them disembarks some riflemen just east of the village of Alexandro-Kalinove, but then gets destroyed by a reported 60 Ukrainian drones. In the end, that's how the Russians are taking the urban area of Yablunivka into a pincer. Now, if we look to the west, towards Pokrovsk, by the 10th of July, the Russians pushed to the Kazeni-Tarets River. Not only 48 hours later, and they had already captured Razine. On the 13th of July, the Russians advanced behind Novotaretsk, and by the 14th, they advanced another 1,500 meters with some forward patrols approaching Radinsky. In this direction, we're witnessing the complete collapse of Ukrainian positions. And that's when the bear claws tightened on Novoekonomichne. Russian troops were spotted north of the settlement, making progress near the tight rear entry. 2 days later, the village of Mykolaivka fell into Russian hands, thus opening Novoekonomichne for a frontal assault. Meanwhile, Ukrainian reinforcements like this T-72E8 tank were pinned down by Russian drones and could not intervene in the battle. If you're interested in studying your family history, I think you'll love my heritage the same way I did. That's how I grew my family tree from this to this. 96 people. It's insane. If you want to enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer, click on the link in the description below or scan the QR code on screen to get your 14-day free trial. So in summary, those were Russian positions between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka on the 15th of April. And this is the situation now 3 months later. We can say it. It's an operational masterpiece, which will have huge consequences for the battle for Donetsk Oblast. In the coming days and weeks, we can expect the Russians to swarm Novoekonomichne from all directions, and simultaneously they could try to storm Rodinsky. This would allow them to roll the Ukrainian left flank in an attempt to envelop Mirnohrad. There we can expect a big battle. Mirnohrad was a city of 45,000 inhabitants before the war, and its urban area is composed of lots of high-rise buildings. If properly defended, it will be a huge chunk to capture for the Russian army. But once Rodinsky and Mirnohrad are secured, the Russian army will close its claws on Pokrovsk. However, this analysis will not be complete without a few words with what's happening in Taretsk. So let's take a look, a little quickie. Last time we covered this sector, the Ukrainian 12th Brigade Azov and the Ilyut Police Brigade launched multiple counterattacks, which reclaimed parts of Taretsk. Since then, the Russian command sent many reinforcements and pushed the Ukrainians on the outskirts. But nothing spectacular. This was a frontline situation on the 15th of April, and this was the situation 3 months later by the 15th of July. Instead, most of the gains were made on the flanks, plus 4 kilometers, namely the breakthrough of these tank regiments of the 150th Motor Rifle Division that broke through Ukrainian lines along the H-20 highway, which we mentioned a couple minutes ago. And according to the latest news, Russian detachments managed to take hold of this mine 2 kilometers north of Tarasivka. Long story short, on the 9th of June, stormtroopers of the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment engaged in close quarters battle for the control of the mine. By the 16th, a Ukrainian rotation of troops indicated the Russians had lost control of the area. On the 25th of June, Ukrainian drone strikes observed increased Russian activity in that sector. And same thing on July 1st, with no Ukrainian troops to be reported nearby, meaning the mine north of Tarasivka was now in Russian control. If we zoom out, the mine is located right here. And that means the situation is very critical for the AFU. If the Russian 20th Division manages to storm Yablunivka, and the 150th Motor Rifle Division advanced just a couple hundred meters forward, which they're already doing by the way, this entire Ukrainian grouping will be trapped, including the 12th Brigade Azov, the same guys that got encircled and that surrendered in Mariupol. Again! So unless the Ukrainian command is completely... It's just a matter of time before Ukrainian formations withdraw north of the Klebanbitske reservoir. In turn, this will bring Russian forces within striking distance of Kostiantynivka. So as you can see, this Russian breakthrough will force the command of the armed forces of Ukraine to choose between Pokrovsk or Kostiantynivka. No way they will be able to defend both of these cities. And if the Russian command is diabolical, they will leave Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka behind and push northwards along the Kazeni-Taryats river. By controlling these 4 villages, Sofivka, Shakhove, Volodymyrivka and Malak, they can do whatever they want in the northern part of Donetsk Oblast. If they do this, it's checkmate. But that's for another time. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.